Hi and welcome along to Sonic Academy Does Loudness with your host Kirk Degiorgio. And first of all, what we're going to show you are a couple of real-world scenarios where loudness comes into play. Now, there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to loudness and metering. Pretty much the only rule is don't go over the digital full-scale limits, because that will result in some horrible digital distortion. But things are quite complex, especially when you come to vintage emulations, plugins that really require sweet spots, that require a different type of metering than the digital ones in most DAWs. But even then, there are no hard and fast rules. It's something that even the experts are quite confused about. It's something I get confused about. So we're all in the same boat here. And what I'm going to try and do is just offer some sensible guidance. We've done some kind of surveying of many of the plugin developers, and they pretty much say the same thing. There's no real hard and fast rules other than the, don't hit your digital peaks over digital full scale 0. Apart from that, with today's DAWs working at such high levels, you've got 32-bit floating point mixers, we've got this huge amount of headroom, and so I've come to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, that it's best with that huge amount of headroom, working at sensible analog VU style levels for all parts of your mix. I think this is the sensible approach, because if you're hitting everything, just trying to get as much with digital full scale without the peaks hitting over 0, then you're going to end up lowering everything, all the levels, to make sure that your mix bus isn't distorting as well. So if there's no sort of signal to noise degradation, if there's no headroom issues whatsoever with hitting modern digital plugins at conservative analog VU style levels, then I think that's the best approach. And it seems that there does seem to be a consensus that you will get more, as a very vague term, musical mixes using this approach. And that's perhaps why VU metering, is still used in every decent studio today. So I have a quick drum loop that I edited up here. First of all, sounds a bit phasey. I always like to have a nice Ableton utility plugin just to start things off. Let's get it in mono. Okay, and what we're going to do now is choose a variety of different. Let's choose some compression. You generally get good metering with compression plugins, because it's important to see what's actually happening as well as hearing it. So let's go to Fabfilter. They're famously one of the makers of the best modern plugin designs. They might sort of incorporate some elements of emulation, but they are generally modern style plugins that you would generally be able to hit with using sort of digital style approach to metering. So you could hit it as close to 0 digital full scale without going over, and you would get normal operation. But then let's say we switch to a plugin that has a vintage emulation. Now these plugin manufacturers go to great lengths to emulate everything from point to point, so they will emulate the input stages. So here you have a classic Neve 33609 compressor, and we are hitting it with the same level, which was pretty much almost close to digital full scale, and you can see here it's compressing quite a lot. Now you won't be able to tell at this kind of levels whether we're hitting this too hard or not is going to be very hard to hear. I mean, they've probably built in some headroom in here that will, you know, be able to cope with much harder and hotter levels. But I'm sure if you are familiar with a real Neve hardware unit, that you'll probably be used to using it at VU levels. So what we're going to do is get a VU meter up here, and there are a couple of VU meters. Waves make a great one, PSP make a good one called Triple. I like to use one from Klanghelm, and I'm going to drag it just before our Neve plug-in here. You can see here we have VU, and if you're not familiar with VU, if you've been using digital, you know, Ableton's own or Logic's own digital metering here, then this will require some explanation. So old school VU meters, the main difference that I like about them is that they act more like the human ear. With digital metering, they're very good at showing you very short-term peak bursts of loudness, even some that the human ear would probably miss. So it's very good if you want to make sure that you're not going to go over your 0 digital full scale. The metering of digital is tailored towards catching those very short bursts of loud audio. Analog VU does it a little bit differently. They are generally a little bit slower, and they will sort of collect all the peaks over a kind of a longer period. It's still an incredibly short period of time, but you get more of an average kind of loudness, and this is how the human ear reacts to loudness too. So there's a good reason why VU meters really work. Now you'll see here, VU, we have a calibration. Now -18, it doesn't seem to be more detailed than that, but I assume that to be they've calibrated 0 on the VU meter to -18 dBFS, which is decibels full scale. There will be some headroom involved in that, but basically you would have to, I'm not going to do the exact maths, but you'd have to hit the VU meter at analog sort of 22 to get the equivalent 0 digital full scale. So it's allowing for plenty of headroom. Even if you hit over into the reds, you've still got a lot of headroom, and I recommend using these whether you're using a vintage emulation plugin or whether you're using a modern plugin. And that's because with today's DAWs, the amount of headroom you have within a mix, you know, 32-bit floating point mixers, and you've got such a large amount of headroom, and there is of course no noise levels to worry about with digital, and it's simply not going to make any difference to your mix if you hit modern digital plugins with conservative analog VU style levels. And so that's why I recommend sticking with this, even if I was to not use a vintage emulator and I would go back, you know, to something like the Fabfilter. And what's really good, some of the plug-in manufacturers now, if I go again to Klanghelm, they have an excellent compressor here, and you can see the VU metering here. You have peak style or VU style. Again, it's calibrated to -18. That seems to be the kind of industry standard. And here you can boost your input, and you can work towards getting as close to the 0 on the analog style VU metering there. And if you're to switch to the peak, you can see you got loads of headrooms, and altogether you're working at a very sensible level. So This is a real world scenario where loudness metering would come into play. You wouldn't necessarily, by using this approach, you wouldn't necessarily have to know whether you're working with, you know, a modern style compressor like the Alpha Mix. You wouldn't need to know, you know, am I working, is this, coded to respond accurately to analog VU style, or is this the kind of modern compressor that, you know, that I can use digital full scale peak metering with? You really, you know, if you stick with the analog VU, it's not going to harm your mix at all with the amount of headroom that we're dealing with if you stick with that, even with these more modern type plugins. So that is the first real world scenario that loudness comes into play, and as I said, there's no hard and fast rules. We've even had some of the plugin coders tell us that the vintage emulations, the 0 dB point that they've calibrated to differs from plugin to plugin. So again, unless you're going to send like a sine wave test signal into every single plugin and you know, see where your measure where your 0 dB on your analog VU and kind of see the equivalent on your digital scale, unless you're going to do that, then you know, it's just best to keep to a sensible conservative levels, whether you're recording external instruments into your DAW or whether you're hitting plugins. That is my advice, and trust me, since I've started doing that, I find that I hardly ever have to lower levels. I hardly ever run out of headroom on bus channels or the master bus channel. You know, you get a perfectly healthy, moderately loud signal that doesn't need a huge amount of gain or lowering to then immediately send off, you know, as a pre-master. So that's what I recommend.
Thanks everybody for watching, commenting and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content, and if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.